When I saw my doctor looking at me like that, I couldn't resist, but I didn't know she liked women. Good afternoon, my dear ones here on the channel. Today I'm going to share something very personal, a story that began a few years ago and still moves me in an irresistible way. My name is Abigail, I'm 37, and I'm married to Arthur, a dedicated man who has always looked after me. Our marriage was peaceful, but everything changed after the car accident that put me in hospital. Between the long days and sleepless nights, I met Olivia, a 25-year-old resident. She was unlike anything I had ever met, with a warm smile and a presence that lit up even the coldest corridors. I didn't know it at the time, but Olivia was about to change my life forever. The hospital was cold, a place where the hours dragged by and people hurried past, almost invisible, until Olivia walked in. Her smile lit up the room in a way that no light could. She approached carefully, adjusting my pillow, asking how I was, but it was different. There was something in her voice, a kindness that seemed to really reach out to me, breaking the isolation I'd felt since the accident. When his hands touched my arm to check the bandages, the warmth of his touch made me forget for a moment the pain and coldness around me. Her eyes, so attentive, carried a curiosity that seemed to go beyond simple medical duty. With every gesture she made, I felt more seen, more human. Over the next few days, I began to look forward to her visits. Click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this. To that smile that seemed to transform my world. She wasn't just my doctor, she was the only part of my day that made me feel alive, and that somehow began to fill a void that I didn't even know existed. Arthur was a good, loving, and dedicated man, but the life we led was marked by routines that he couldn't seem to escape. Between work and hospital visits, he did his best to be by my side, but the time he spent away left an emptiness that grew in silence. During these absences, it was Olivia who filled the space. Every time she visited, the room was filled with something I couldn't describe. It wasn't just her professional care or her way of making me feel special. It was the connection that emerged between us. Olivia paid attention to my every word, laughed at my stories, and always found a way to make the day lighter. And, as the days went by, I began to notice something inside me that disconcerted me. His presence made my heart race in a way I hadn't expected. I loved Arthur, but the way Olivia looked at me and made me feel made me question things that had never crossed my mind before. The days at the hospital began to take on a different rhythm. Olivia's visits became the highlight of my routine, and unbeknownst to her, they filled a void that I couldn't explain. When she entered the room, everything around me seemed to fade into the background. Her conversations went beyond the basics, beyond medical courtesy. We talked about books, movies, even her challenges in residency. I listened to her attentively, but what stuck with me the most was the way she looked into my eyes, as if she saw something in me that no one else saw. Sometimes the silence between us said more than words. Olivia had a lightness, a presence that transformed the cold hospital environment into something almost cozy. To her, I was probably just another patient, someone to share a few laughs with to ease the burden of the routine. But for me, she was a refuge in the midst of the chaos, someone who was beginning to awaken something new, something I had never allowed myself to feel. One quiet afternoon at the hospital, while we were talking about our routines, Olivia mentioned something that took me by surprise. Between laughs and stories, we discovered that we lived in the same condominium. The coincidence made me feel uneasy, as if fate was playing tricks on me. I tried not to show it, but my heart raced at the thought that, outside those cold corridors, our lives could cross paths again. The thought of seeing her beyond the hospital walls awakened something I could barely name. At that moment, I felt courage growing inside me, an impulse that came straight from everything Olivia made me feel. I took a deep breath and, before I could hesitate, suggested that we meet for coffee when I was discharged. She smiled in surprise, but her positive response gave me a mixture of relief and anxiety. The thought of seeing her in another context, of finding out more about who she was, made that day different from all the others. Something was changing, and I knew there was no turning back. After my discharge, we arranged to meet at a bakery near the condominium. I arrived early, anxiously trying to control the rapid beating of my heart. When Olivia walked in, with that smile I already knew, but which seemed even brighter outside the hospital, the atmosphere took on a different energy. She wasn't wearing a lab coat, and that made her even more charming, more real. We sat by the window and the conversation began as naturally as ever. We talked about simple things, from the best options on the menu to dreams we hadn't yet realized. But there was something between the lines, something in the way our gazes met and made us smile for no apparent reason. Her every gesture, her every laugh pulled me closer to a truth that I tried to ignore. Olivia wasn't just the doctor who looked after me. She was a fascinating woman, and being there at that table made a feeling grow inside me that I could no longer deny. After coffee, as we walked back, Olivia suggested we go to a nearby bar. I hesitated for a moment, but her excitement was contagious, and I accepted. The place was cozy, with low lighting that created an almost magical atmosphere. We ordered drinks and sat down at a more reserved table. With every sip and every laugh, I felt the walls around me begin to crumble. Olivia told stories about the house, her family, and her dreams, and the lightness with which she spoke was something that held me. It was as if, for a few hours, I could forget the routine, the responsibilities, and even the accident that had brought me there. His presence was magnetic, and the sound of his laughter seemed to make the environment around us disappear. For a moment, I felt that the outside world didn't exist, as if everything could be summed up in that moment with her. I knew that something was changing, because that night I allowed myself to feel something I would never have imagined, something that went beyond control. When we got back to the condominium, Olivia looked at me with that peaceful smile and suggested that I visit her apartment. I agreed, trying to look casual, but my heart was racing. We went up together, and as we entered, I was greeted by a space that was a reflection of her, cozy, delicate, and full of personality. Books stacked in the corner, travel photos on the walls, and soft music filling the room. Olivia opened a bottle of wine and offered me a glass while she showed me the details of the place. The conversation flowed naturally, but there was something different in the air. Every word, every gesture seemed to carry silent intentions. We sat on the sofa, and the distance between us seemed to disappear little by little. I noticed little details: the way she flicked her hair, the sparkle in her eyes when she smiled. The intimate atmosphere made everything around us seem closer, more intense. There, in that room, I felt that something bigger was happening, something I didn't know if I could or wanted to hold back. Sitting on the sofa in Olivia's apartment, the conversation took on a more personal tone. She opened her heart in a way that caught me off guard, talking about the difficulties of residency, the pressure to be perfect, and the moments when she felt vulnerable. Her words had a raw honesty, something I rarely found in anyone. I shared a bit of myself too, talking about the years of marriage to Arthur, the love I felt for him, but also about the feeling of emptiness that sometimes arose, as if something was missing. Olivia listened attentively, without judgment, her eyes fixed on mine. The more we talked, the more the room seemed to shrink. The distance between us was minimal, and every word seemed to bring us closer together. When our hands touched briefly, I felt a spark that made me hold my breath. It was as if everything around us disappeared. I knew I was on the verge of crossing a line that would change my life, and the weight of that moment was as frightening as it was irresistible. The conversation flowed with an intimacy I had never experienced until Olivia noticed my uneasy expression and asked about my legs. I was still in pain from the accident, and, with her usual kindness, she offered to give me a massage to relieve the tension. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted, trying to ignore the whirlwind of emotions that was already growing inside me. Olivia sat closer, carefully taking hold of my legs. Her touch was gentle, almost hesitant at first, but with each movement, I felt something more intense emerge. It was as if the seemingly simple gesture carried meanings that neither of us dared to verbalize. My heart raced and my breathing became heavier as the closeness between us seemed to dissolve any remaining barriers. She looked at me for a moment, and in that gaze there was something undeniable. It wasn't just care or kindness. It was desire, and at that moment, my own desire became impossible to hide. The evening progressed, and the conversation between us became quieter, as if we both knew that words were no longer enough to express what was happening. Olivia was talking about something trivial, but my attention was divided between her words and the sound of my own rapid breathing. Then, suddenly, her hand touched mine. It was a brief gesture, almost as if it had happened by chance, but the intensity of that touch hit me like thunder. A shiver ran through my body, and my mind, which had previously struggled to maintain control, was silenced. In that instant, there was no more apartment, music, or wine. It was just her, so close that I could feel the warmth of her skin, and me, trying to process the avalanche of feelings that were mixing inside me. The touch, although simple, carried a meaning that we both understood. It was no longer possible to ignore what was happening. The world around us seemed suspended, frozen in that single moment when everything had changed. After the touch, my eyes sought out Olivia's almost unintentionally, and when our gazes met, time seemed to stop. It wasn't just a look. It was something much deeper, almost as if we were speaking a silent language that only the two of us understood. The intensity of that moment completely disarmed me. It wasn't just the physical closeness or the words exchanged before. It was the connection that hung between us, so palpable that it seemed to fill all the space around us. I couldn't turn away, as if something bigger was holding us there, in that exchange that said everything we couldn't say out loud. There was tenderness, desire, curiosity, and above all, understanding. It was as if, in that instant, Olivia saw something in me that even I didn't know existed. I felt a warmth spread through my body, an inexplicable certainty that this moment had a greater meaning. For the first time, click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this. Everything seemed to make sense, even if I still couldn't understand why. The sound of my cell phone vibrating broke the spell of the moment, bringing me back to reality with an almost cruel impact. I looked at the screen and saw a message from Arthur. "How are you, my love?" The words, simple and full of care, made my chest tighten. For an instant, Olivia's apartment seemed to dissolve, replaced by the image of my husband, always so devoted, always so present, even in her absence. I felt sudden guilt mixed with confusion. I loved Arthur, that was undeniable, but I also couldn't deny what was happening there, in that room, with Olivia. It was something that transcended any logical explanation. I took a deep breath, replying to the message with a simple, "I'm fine," even though I knew I was far from fine. When I put my phone away and looked up, Olivia was watching me in silence, with an expression that mixed understanding and concern. Arthur's message had brought up a conflict that I knew I would have to face, but not that night. Not yet. After replying to Arthur's message, I tried to push aside the weight of the internal conflict and focus on the present. Olivia, noticing my hesitation, offered me another glass of wine and brought back the lightness that always seemed to surround her. We talked about everything and nothing, and the night became a mosaic of laughter, confidences, and comfortable silences. She told me about her dreams, her insecurities, and the challenges she faced in medicine, and I found myself opening my heart too, in a way I had never done before. Every word exchanged seemed to bring us closer together, but it also brought up the fear of what it meant. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something deeper, more real. I felt like we were sailing into uncharted territory, and despite all the connection we felt, the possible consequences loomed over me like a shadow. It was impossible to ignore what was growing between us, but the fear of where it would take us was beginning to take shape. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I said goodbye to Olivia with a hesitant smile. The silence between us said more than any words could. I walked back home, feeling the cold dawn contrast with the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last, as if I were carrying all the doubts and feelings that the night had awakened. When I entered the house, the familiar space seemed strangely distant, almost empty. Arthur would be back in a few hours, and the routine I had always considered safe now seemed to be a barrier holding me back. Olivia had awakened something in me, something that wasn't just desire, but a rediscovery of parts of me that I had buried. At the same time, I knew that my choices from that moment on would not only affect me, but also Arthur and everything we had built together. Sitting in the living room, alone with my thoughts, I realized that the road ahead would be anything but simple. Lying on the sofa in the living room, with the house plunged into silence, every moment of the night before came back to my mind with unsettling clarity. Olivia's laughter, the warmth of her touch, her deep gaze that seemed to strip me of all the masks I wore to the world. But it wasn't just about desire. It was deeper than that. Olivia had touched a part of me that I didn't even know was dormant. A part that yearned for something more, something that went beyond the predictable routines and security that Arthur and I had built up over the years. I wondered when I began to disconnect from myself, to live only to fulfill roles, forgetting who I really was. Olivia, with her sincerity and lightness, had reminded me of the woman I once was, full of dreams, curiosity, and life. It wasn't just about her, but about what she represented. Discovering who I was no longer an option, but a necessity. And that in itself was frightening and liberating at the same time. Sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of cold coffee in my hands, I felt the weight of the dilemma that now dominated my mind. Arthur was my safe haven, the person who had been by my side through all the difficult times, someone who loved me unquestioningly. But then Olivia came along, bringing a freedom I didn't even know I wanted. With her, I was a version of myself that had been buried for a long time, forgotten by routine and responsibilities. How could I move on without hurting Arthur, a man who had given me nothing but love and dedication? Was it possible to reconcile these two parts of me? The one that wanted stability, and the one that wanted something new, intense, and transformative. Each possibility seemed to lead to a different kind of loss. I didn't want to choose between the woman I was with Arthur and the woman Olivia awakened in me, but deep down, I knew I couldn't have both. That choice, when it came, would change everything, and I still didn't know if I was ready to make it. After everything I've been through, I keep wondering how I got here, how an accident that seemed to be just another difficult chapter in my life became the start of something that would shake all my certainties. Arthur is the foundation that builds security around me, but Olivia has awakened in me a hunger for freedom, for discovery, for feeling something that transcends the ordinary. What is most important? The stability of a life built with love and dedication, or the possibility of something new, which makes me question who I am and who I want to be. Choosing seems impossible, as if any path would lead me to lose a part of myself. So I ask you, what if you were me? Would you risk everything for a passion that makes you feel alive, but is accompanied by uncertainty and pain? Or would you stay with the security of a love that has already given you so much, but perhaps no longer completes you? Leave your opinion. Your answer could be the advice I so desperately need. This story doesn't end here. Listen to it all by clicking on the exclusive playlist on the right, or click on the video on the left and listen to the best story on the channel.